Chapter 1. Forest fires had been destroying a lot of valuable timber and blackening the summer range on the forest reserve, and ranchers had been forced to move their livestock out. Old-timers claimed it was the driest summer they'd ever seen in Montana. Prairie ranges were parched, the waterholes dried up, and big creeks shrank to a trickle that crept laboriously along between boggy banks. And over it all hung the smoke pall from the forest fires. The night was breathless and sultry, and the full moon was a blood-red ball in the star-hidden sky. It was long past midnight, but still an hour or two before dawn when Rip Campbell heard a hound baying. Then more hounds took up the night song, and the deep baying reminded him of Uncle Tom's cabin, and of Eliza crossing the ice with little Eva in her arms, and then the bloodhounds baying on her trail. The thought made him grin flatly in the darkness. Then one of the hound pack began howling, and other dogs took it up, and, though the night was sultry hot, Rip Campbell shivered. Because a howling dog is a sign that somebody is going to die. He slid his saddle carbine part ways out of its scabbard, then shoved it back. But when he let his horse travel on at a running walk down the wagon trail from the wide flat bench to the ranch below, he kept his right hand near his six-shooter. Finally the log buildings and pole corrals took on black shapes in the red-tinted moonlight, and he reined up in front of the big log barn with a pack of perhaps 20 big hounds surrounding him and his horse and keeping him in the saddle. Some of the hounds were slick-haired and showed the Great Dane strain. Others were shaggy, longer-headed and rangy, like Irish wolfhounds. Two were big Orang-Outang Airedale bear dogs. Most of the younger dogs were a savage mixture of all three breeds. There wasn't a wagging tail in the lot, and whenever Rip Campbell moved in his saddle their big white fangs bared. Not a light head showed at the long log bunkhouse or the small whitewashed log cabin alongside it, or at the big two-storied log house with the vine-screened porch. And nobody showed up to call off the dogs that acted as though they would tear him apart if he swung from his saddle. But Rip Campbell knew he had been sighted, that more than one pair of eyes had watched him ride down off the bench and past the corrals and scattered buildings to the big log barn. This was the Valentine Ranch, and a few miles back yonder, where the wagon road crossed the creek, Rip had ridden up along the sign post, and the lettering, black on white, was big and bold enough to be made out even in the red moonlight. It read, "Valentine Range. Keep off. This means you." Eyes had watched him. The hound pack had warned the ranch of his coming. Over in the big house grizzled Zeke Valentine had quit snoring at the first deep-toned baying of old Chloe, the only bloodhound on the place. Valentine moved with a swift sureness in the darkness of his big bedroom. First he took his battered old Stetson from the bedpost and jammed it on his tousle gray head. He pulled on his pants, tucking most of the tail of his nightshirt into the waistband and hitching one gallus up over a burly shoulder. Then he took his looped cartridge belt with its holstered six-shooter from the headpost where his hat also hung and buckled it around his wide middle and grunted as he pulled on his boots. He reached out and, without groping, found the half-empty bottle of rye on the table beside his bed, and he pulled the cork and drank deeply. Then, corking the bottle, he picked up a double-barreled sawed-off shotgun on his way out into the dark hallway. A young woman stood at the far end of the hallway, a lighted candle in her hand. She had on a crimson silk wrapper fastened around her waist by a broad black silk sash. Her blue-black hair, parted in the middle, was pulled back and plaited into a pair of heavy braids that hung below the sash. Her face was long with faint shadows under the high cheekbones, almost heavy black brows, heavily fringed eyes as green as deep lake water, and a high-bridged, well-shaped nose. Polly Valentine was strikingly beautiful, tall, slender, proud-looking. There was a silver-mounted gun in her hand, and she handled it like an expert, her long tapering fingers almost caressing the carved ivory handle. Behind her stood a coal-black Great Dane with ears trimmed to a point. "Visitors, Uncle Zeke?" A soft, husky voice. "Somebody don't believe in signs. Put out that damn light." With a smile that showed her white teeth, Polly blew out the flickering candlelight and followed him out onto the wide, vine-covered veranda. Below the veranda gravel crunched under high-heeled boots. A man's flat-toned voice came up to them. "Lone horsebacker, Zeke." "Damn it all, Troy." Valentine's voice was a growl. "Sing out sooner," she had after this. "Want to get that head of yours blown off? Where's Richard?" "Rick," said Troy, the Valentine ramrod, "is sleeping off his town jag." "Someday," growled Zeke Valentine. "I'm going to double me a wet rope and whip that whelp off my range and plumb back to Texas. Drunk, shiftless. He should be ramrodding the outfit I got to leave him and his sister when I kicked the bucket. But no, by devil. I got to hire me a damned gunslinging tough cowhand to ramrod this spread. Well, what the devil you hanging around here for, Troy? Get down there to the barn and earn them fighting wages you're drawing. That's what I'm paying you 10 times your worth for. Not to come mooning around my niece. Troy muttered something and stalked away. Tall, wide-shouldered, lean-flanked, he had the gait of a cowpuncher. Darkness hid the sinister glint in his pale gray eyes, the twist of his thin-lipped mouth under its neatly trimmed black mustache. A handsome man, Troy. Black Irish or part Injun, old Zeke Valentine claimed. A crackerjack cowhand anywhere you put him, Troy handled his tough cowhands with a brutal efficiency. And he was rank swift poison with a gun. He had a 6-shooter in one hand now. A coiled shot-loaded blacksnake whip in the other. The whip was for the dogs. It was the only way he could handle the hound pack. Deep inside him he was afraid of the dogs which belonged to Polly Valentine. Polly saw the blacksnake in Troy's hand as he walked swiftly away and was lost in the black smoky shadows of the night. Her laugh was soft, mirthless, husky. And she reached down with one hand and rubbed the stiff hackles of the Dane's neck and shoulders. "Hate him, don't you, devil?" she said softly. "One of these times," growled Zeke Valentine. "Them blasted hounds of yours will kill somebody. A man can't step out the door without them following him. Because they like you, Uncle Zeke. And they like Rick. Must be your whiskey odor. You growl and snarl at them but they wag their tails like fool pups. They don't trust Troy, though. Who does? Them dogs has sense. You coming?" Valentine headed for the barn. Rip Campbell sat his horse in the dim red moonlight, the hound pack eyeing him in white-fanged silence. Then he saw the tall man walking toward him, a 6-shooter in his hand. "Your hound's Rip kept his hand on his gun got me treed like a possum. Step down, stranger. I'll leave jobs like that to Daniel in his lion's den, mister." "Back." Troy's voice was sharp-edged. "Back to your den." The wide popper of the black snake cracked like a pistol. The hound pack turned on the ramrod, snarling, teeth bared. The black snake hissed and cracked. A big wiry-haired brindle hound crouched 19 as though he was going to spring at Troy. Then Polly Valentine's husky voice sounded. "Here, boys. Come to heel." The big dog circled past Troy and his whip and surrounded the girl who came on slowly out of the night shadows. She stood there in the silk wrapper as blood-red as the moon and her husky voice was low-toned with fury. "Throw away that whip, Troy. If ever you hit one of my dogs, I'll let them at you. If ever they tackle me, Lee they'll be the deadest pack of mongrels you ever seen when I'm done shooting." Troy kept his black snake. Rip Campbell was staring at the girl, inarticulate, slack-jawed, awed by the sight of her exotic beauty. You might expect to see such a woman on the stage. But not on a Montana cattle ranch. He pulled off his hat, suddenly aware of the fact that he hadn't shaved for a week and that his hair was sweat-matted and needed cutting. He felt awkward and clumsy and tongue-tied. "Who in blazes are you, stranger?" Big Zeke Valentine stalked past the girl and her hound pack, the sawed-off shotgun in the crook of his arm and his eyes slits of steel under ragged brows. "Where's the rest of your night-riding outfit?" "I'm alone. Headed for a town called Prairie. Took the wrong fork in the wagon trail." "What fetches you here?" "Seen Valentine. A played-out leg-weary gelding. If you'll stake me to a fresh horse travel along." "You read the sign at the roundup crossing on Valentine Creek," growled the big grizzled cowman. "It was dark, mister." Rip Campbell saw them eyeing him as he sat his horse. The big cowman. The 6-foot Troy. The red-gowned girl with the dogs. Sweat bathed him and there was a cold feeling in the pit of his empty stomach. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Hadn't slept for 2 nights. Pain from his freshly healed bullet wounds clawed at his back and thighs. Above the stubble of dusty and sweat-grimed dirty yellow whiskers his skin was a sweat-beaded gray color and his bloodshot blue-gray eyes were deep sunken in dark sockets. He was near the point of exhaustion. He should have taken the advice of those Wyoming doctors and stayed another 2 weeks or a month in the Wind River Hospital. He'd traveled the last 100 miles on his nerve. It was catching up with him now. Right now when he needed all his strength and wits. He was hanging onto the saddle horn, swaying a little, fighting off the black waves of dizziness. "Drunk." Old Zeke Valentine's growl sounded dimly in Rip's ears. "He's not drunk, Uncle Zeke. Sick. Hurt. There he goes. Grab him before he hits the ground, Troy." Rip Campbell slid his feet from the stirrups and hung onto the saddle horn, keeping his hold on it as his right leg swung across the saddle cantle. He was standing on both feet, still hanging to the saddle horn when he passed out, an apologetic grin on his wide, tight-lipped mouth. He came alive with the burning taste of raw whiskey in his throat. The biggest, blackest, most vicious-looking dog he had ever seen in his life was standing over him. The dog licked his whiskered blunt jaw and Rip heard a girl's soft, husky laugh. "You big softy, sissy." Rip Campbell grinned, ashamedly, and tried to sit up. He was lying on a big wide couch covered with a Navajo blanket. In a huge room with varnished log walls and polished hardwood floor. A big lamp burned on a huge table that was littered with books. "Not you," said the girl. "Devil." First time he ever made up like that to anybody. "That's a welcome, stranger. And the best recommendation you could get around these parts, so far as I'm concerned. I'm Polly Valentine. Who are you?" "Rip Campbell." Called Rip, mostly. She poured him a stiff drink. He was rubbing the Dane's head behind the pointed ears. The dog's yellow eyes stared at him. The tail did not wag. But the cold wet muzzle shoved into the sweaty dusty bristle of his whiskers. Rip took the filled glass from the girl and he had to hold it in both hands. The whiskey went down like liquid fire. And when it melted the cold lump inside his belly and fired the blood in his veins, he sat up. Polly Valentine had changed into a soft gray dress and coiled the two bed braids like a crown on her head. She smiled faintly, her green eyes watching him with faint amusement. "Just a stranger in a strange land," she said in her husky voice. "Just drifting through, Rip?" "Sort of." Pain shot through his back and down into his thighs like a knife stab in the back. He winced a little. "Hurt?" Polly asked softly. And poured whiskey from a cut glass decanter into the glass he still held. "Kind of lame." He gulped down the drink and shook his head and handed her the empty glass. "That's all I can take on an empty stomach." "When did you eat last?" "Yesterday about daybreak." She nodded and crossed over to the table and lifted a big white cloth from hot food. "There's water and soap and a clean towel in the washroom yonder." She pointed to a door in the corner of the big room. "Can you make it?" Rip said he reckoned he could. The big black Dane followed him across the room. There was a big pitcher of hot water. Another pitcher of cold water. He spent about 5 minutes washing up, grinning at his reflection in the shaving mirror. There was a shaving outfit there and he stropped the razor and lathered his face and shaved quickly, nicking himself in 2 or 3 places. But he was clean-shaved and not quite so tough-looking when he walked out of the washroom. He was half tipsy and felt good for the first time in days. Polly Valentine filled 2 cups with strong black coffee and motioned with the coffee pot for him to sit down. Half a dozen fried eggs, fried potatoes and bacon were heaped on a plate and there were hot biscuits with chokecherry jam on the table that was set with a red and white checkered cloth and solid silver. Rip tried not to wolf his grub. Polly Valentine sat across from him sipping black coffee and looking too beautiful to be real. On the table beyond Rip's reach was his cartridge belt and holstered gun. "Uncle Zeke and Troy are eating breakfast with the men," Polly said. "They'll be here soon. So get your story straight." "What story?" he countered. The girl's green eyes were watching him narrowly. Her red mouth smiled at him, there was mockery in her smile. "Whatever your story is." She reached into a pocket of the gray dress and took out a law badge. United States Deputy Marshal was engraved on the metal. She tossed it across the table to him. "I found it in your pocket, before Troy frisked you." "Lucky. Troy doesn't like law officers. Nor does Zeke Valentine. So don't pin that badge on your shirt. And if you want it this way, I'll keep my mouth shut." DDoS face flushed redly. "Gosh. That's mighty nice of you, ma'am. But I'm not. Polly is my name, Rip, when they're not around. And don't thank me. There's a motive behind my secrecy. I might need you. You and your law. Is it a deal?" Rip Campbell looked straight into the girl's green eyes. He read something like terror there. But only for the briefest fraction of a moment. "It's a deal," he heard himself telling Polly Valentine. "I knew you couldn't fool devil. Look at him. The big clown." The big black Dane shoved his massive head in Rip's lap. Rip scratched the dog's neck. Then the dog walked around to where Polly sat in a huge leather chair and shoved his head in her lap. Underscore. "If ever Troy tried to lay a hand on him," said Polly quietly, "Devil would tear his throat out, or if ever Troy forgot himself and touched me, the pack would tear him apart. Dogs are like that, you can't buy their loyalty or friendship. And it takes more than a black snake or gun to stop that pack. Later on, he'll make you acquainted with them all. If Bryn takes you on as a friend, the rest of the pack will let you bree or he'll shake their hides off. Had enough to eat, Rip?" That's the best bait of grub I ever tackled. Rip Campbell grinned and reached for tobacco and papers. He was tongue-tied again when he tried to thank her. And before he could get his tongue untied, the front door opened, and a tall, lean, handsome-looking young cowpuncher in his early 20s lurched into the room, shut the door behind him and leaned against it. His curly dark chestnut hair was rumpled, sweat damp, his bloodshot green-gray eyes a little glazed. His tailored gray flannel shirt and whipcord pants were rumpled and spotted with spilled liquor. A stubble of reddish whiskers marred the clean line of his jaw. "Listen, sis. Got to have $5,000. The tin horns took me." Then he saw Rip Campbell and he stiffened, staring suspiciously. "Who's he, Polly?" His voice was suddenly harsh. "A stranger, Rick. He got lost on his way to town. Take your hand off your gun. You look silly. Better wash up. I've got to see you alone." His voice was sullen. "To the tune of $5,000. She turned to Rip Campbell. "My brother, Richard Valentine. Rick, for short. Sober, he's a good kid. Drunk, he's a mess. He's got a hangover now that's a prize winner. Rick, this is Rip Campbell. Uncle Zeke and Troy are going to put him through the mill directly. Wash the cobwebs away and sit in on the session. But keep your auntie out of it." Rick Valentine headed for the decanter. He poured himself 2 big drinks and downed them fast. The glazed look went out of his eyes and he grinned. It was a boyish kind of grin, but weak. "You won't let me down, sis. Not if you'll sober up and quit gambling, pull yourself up by the old bootstraps, bub. Or you'll be going down the road talking to yourself, unless you like staying on here as a 40 a month cowhand and calling Troy Mr. Troy has that batch of I.0.U. you wrote out for the tin horn gamblers at Prairie. Where'd he, who? Troy? Don't ask me how he got hold of them. He offered them to me for a price. Now go clean up." But Rick Valentine did not go. He stood there, long legs spread, his brows pulled into a twisted scowl, blinking the glazed film from his eyes, fighting to sober up. "What kind of a price did that damn Troy hang on my lousy gambling paper, sis?" Rick Valentine forgot his tough swagger. The sulky, sullen tone was gone from his voice. He spoke quietly and his gray-green eyes were clearing and he looked as though he could be dangerous. Polly smiled faintly. "Troy must have seen the roadshow troopers play the drunkard. He's playing the heavy villain. He demands the gal's hand in marriage, with the Valentine outfit thrown in for boot. And if you don't see eye to eye with him, he'll take my gambling debts to Uncle Zeke. You're catching on, bub." "Tell Troy," said Rick Valentine, "to go to hell. If he gets bothersome, sick your dogs on the big gunslinger. Let him hand those tin horn I.0.U. over to Uncle Zeke. I'll take my medicine. And I'll pay off Troy with his own kind of coin." He slapped his gun butt. Polly shook her head. "Maybe that's just the kind of a play Troy wants you to make. Gunfighting is his trade. You wouldn't have a sheepherder's chance." She turned to Rip Campbell. "Am I right? Sounds like this Troy gent is playing for high stakes. No holds barred. Who sold this stranger chips in the game, Polly?" Rick scowled. "I did." Polly lowered her voice. "But Troy's dealing from a cold deck. Swap guns with Rip. Troy salted the cartridges in his. Quick. And reload Rip's gun if you aim to use it." Rick Valentine stared hard at Rip Campbell. Then at his sister. Sliding his 6-shooter from its holster, he swapped it for the gun on the table. He shoved Rip Campbell's gun into his holster, leaving his 6-shooter in Rip's holster with its filled cartridge belt on the big table. The guns were alike, black-handled Colt .45s. "Troy doesn't know I watched him substitute doctored cartridges in your gun," Polly told Rip Campbell. "He'll try to crowd you into making a gunplay, so don't let him pull you into the trap. But if you have no other choice, draw first and shoot to kill. At least you'll have a loaded gun in your hand. And Troy will figure it's harmless as a shooting iron." "Who is this gent?" repeated Rick Valentine. "I don't know," Polly said. "But he's on my side. Now clean up." When her brother had gone, Rick reached for the whiskey, then changed his mind with a grimace. His tough swagger was gone when he walked away. But it seemed to Rip Campbell that young Rick Valentine was more of a man when he left the room than he'd been when he made his tipsy entrance. "Rick's a spoiled brat," said Polly. "Wild. Wants to be tough but hasn't what it takes to back the play. And Troy prods him on. Troy would like to see Rick Valentine get killed in a saloon brawl. Just as he'd like to see a gunfight between Uncle Zeke and Old Ward Dixon, with Zeke Valentine on the losing end. Then Troy would marry Polly Valentine in the Valentine outfit. His tough cowhands would wipe out the Dixons. Old Ward and Ward's son Jimmy. Troy has his eye on the Dixon quarter circle D outfit. Troy's ambitious, no? Just a country boy trying to get along in the world. Troy stood in the doorway, a flat-lipped grin on his face, his hand on his gun. Polly whirled around. Rip Campbell turned his head and he wondered how long the Valentine ramrod had been standing there. Boot heels clumped and big grizzled Zeke Valentine followed Troy into the room. The cowman's steel-gray eyes narrowed under his ragged gray brows. Old Zeb was a huge man, big as a silver-tipped grizzly, and he moved with a grizzly's heavy speed. Powerful, ruthless, domineering, his voice a barrel-chested growl. Have any trouble with the fellow, Polly? No trouble at all, Uncle Zeke. One gave him a drink of your liquor and fed him. Like fattening something for the slaughterer. Her green eyes looked past Zeke Valentine to Troy. The big hawk-beaked ramrod grinned faintly. Old Zeke growled into his ragged gray mustache and poured himself a drink and gulped it down. Better you went outside a while, Polly, he said. Me and Troy want to talk with this fellow. Don't mind your cussing, Uncle Zeke. I'll sit in the corner. You'll get out. And take your blasted dog along. Polly shrugged her shoulders. The Dane followed her out of the room and the door closed behind her and the big dog. Buckle on your gun, mister, Troy flatly. It was daylight outside now. Sad Zeke Valentine pulled aside the heavy-set curtains to let the light into the room. Then he blew out the lamp. The early morning light filtered in, gray and smoke-laden from the distant forest fire. And the sun rose like a blood-red fireball in the smoke-shrouded sky. Then the big grizzled cowman stood on widespread legs, thumbs hooked in his sagging cartridge belt, his sweat-marked hat pulled at a slant on his grizzled head. His eyes were slits of glittering steel. He growled out his questions. You ain't deaf, dumb nor blind, stranger. You read that warning sign last night. You know there's a cattle war going on between my outfit and Ward Dixon's layout. Montana's got too cramped to hold me and that damned land-grabbing, water-stealing cattle thief. I had to hire Troy and his tough outfit to buck range again the gun-packing cowhands that damn old scoundrel Ward Dixon imported from Wyoming, Ralph Millsap and his renegades, as mangy a pack of coyote things as ever roamed the earth unhung. Them night-riding renegades has us suspicious of strangers. This is your first and last chance to spread your cards face up. I've read them. Commence talking. Rip Campbell stared into the cowman's eyes without flinching. Stared until old Zeke Valentine was the first to look away. Then Troy broke the heavy uneasy silence. Troy stood a few feet away, his hand on his gun, and in a flat-toned voice he began cursing. His pale gray eyes narrowed. Thin-lipped mouth twisting, he called Rip Campbell every foul-fighting name he could think of. And old Zeke Valentine stood back a ways watching. Rip Campbell sat in his big leather chair. Rolling a cigarette, he lit it and let the smoke drift from his nostrils. It was as if he were listening to something that was no concern of his. And it was Troy, not Rip, who weakened first. Sweat beaded Troy's lean dark face and trickled down from under his tilted hat. His voice got dry and rasping. A heavy rush of blood colored his almost swarthy skin and his pale eyes congested. Bloodshot, they mirrored the pent-up fury that lifted his voice from its toneless pitch to a loud rasping shout. You gutless coward. A gun. Fill your hand. But Rip Campbell made no gun move. Just sat back in his chair, his both hands resting on the big leather arms. Tobacco smoke drifting lazily from his nostrils. Relaxed, indifferent, until Troy pulled his six-shooter. Then Rip Campbell's gun hand moved, so fast that neither Troy nor Zeke Valentine realized he was going into action. Because Rip Campbell's right arm and hand moved and the rest of his body remained relaxed and stretched out in the big chair. And then his six-shooter was gripped in his hand and it never lifted more than to tilt its blued steel barrel. Then it spat flame. Its heavy .45 slug hit the cylinder of Troy's gun and tore it from the big ramrod's hand with an explosion that sent the gun spinning through the air to land in a far corner. Troy's gun hand, torn, bleeding, flipped crazily in the air. Shock, pain, bewilderment and sudden fear drained the color from his dark sweaty face and his pale eyes widened. He grabbed his injured hand and held it in back towards the door. The crashing gun echoes died in the room and there was the pungent odor of burnt gunpowder. Rip Campbell was on his feet now and his gun pointed at old Zeke Valentine's big belly. Take it easy, big mister, Rip Campbell told the cowman. I don't like this kind of ruckus. Better tell your pack-tough ramrod to slow up. Looks to me like he's backing the seat of his britches into that black hound dog's face. The door had opened and Polly stood there in the hallway. The big Dane blocked the doorway, teeth bared, growling softly, yellow eyes watching Troy. Troy turned his head. When he saw the dog, he froze in his tracks. Polly Valentine's face looked pale, but she was smiling now and the color came back into her cheeks. Shooting always excites him. Her hand was on the Dane's massive head. Troy glared at her. He cut a swift look at the gun in Rip Campbell's hand, then back at the girl. He opened his mouth to say something, but changed his mind and clamped his jaws shut. Rick Valentine came down the hallway. He had washed up and put on clean overalls and a clean shirt, and he looked cold sober when he pushed past his sister, rubbed the dog's hackles and walked into the big room. He grinned at Troy's injured hand. A taunting kind of grin. Then his gray-green eyes hardened. "My sister says you've been bothering her, Troy. Some kind of slimy blackmail. You've got about $5,000 worth of my Tinhorn gambling paper. Did you buy up my .0.u. from your Tinhorn friends? Or are you acting as their agent to collect what I lost to them?" "They was fixing to take it up," said Troy. "With Zeke. I heard Uncle Zeke tell you he was done paying your booze and poker bills. So I bought up your gambling paper. Trying to do you a favor." "You lie, Troy," said Rick Valentine. "You tried to blackmail my sister into marrying you. What you need is a horsewhipping. I'll give you one." He walked over to the table where Troy had left his black snake. Then Rick pulled a roll of money from his pocket, tossed it on the table and picked up the loaded black snake. "Lay my gambling paper there on the table, Troy. And pick up the money." Troy hesitated, murder glinting in his pale eyes. The black snake whip hissed as Rick Valentine flipped it back. Then the heavy whip lashed out, and before Troy could lift his arms to ward it off, it cut him across the face and slashed back and struck again, leaving a welt and a trickle of blood across Troy's face. And Polly had to hold on to the big black Dane or the dog would have torn Troy's throat out. The dog was growling and whimpering, fangs bared, trembling in its savage eagerness to kill the man he hated. Rick Valentine coiled the black snake whip and grinned mirthlessly. "That's just a small sample, Troy. Now lay my gambling notes on the table and take your money. And if ever you speak to my sister again, I'll kill you." Troy's face was bone white and the whip welts ridged his skin. He turned and glared at Zeke Valentine. "It's your deal." Troy's voice was rasping, thick. "Take over." Rip Campbell had been watching the big grizzled cowman from the corner of his eye. Zeke Valentine had stood there in his big tracks, motionless, his puckered steel-gray eyes glinting and a faint grin twitching the corners of his mouth under the drooping gray mustache. "When a man like you, Troy, a big tough ramrod that travels on his hard rep, takes a whipping of any kind, he's through. He's wore out his usefulness. You lost your gun, Troy. Better saddle your private and hit the trail." Troy looked like a man who had just been kicked hard in the belly. Letting go his injured hand, he reached into his pocket and took out some soiled-looking folded papers and tossed them on the table. He picked up the money without bothering to count it and shoved it into his pocket. His pale eyes, bloodshot, slitted, cut a brief contemptuous look at young Rick Valentine, and it was like the flick of a whip. Then he looked at Polly and there was a cold, vicious threat in the long look he gave her. Rip Campbell felt the hard impact of Troy's stare and grinned crookedly at the big ramrod. "Loaded, wasn't it, Troy?" Rip said softly. Troy forced a thin-lipped grin. "Keep it loaded. I'll make you use it again." Then Troy turned on Zeke Valentine and he voiced his threat flattened. "This is going to cost you your Valentine outfit, Zeke." Turning, Troy walked across the hash room and let himself out the front door. They heard him call out to his men. "Saddle your private horses, boys. We're headed for town and hiring out to Ward Dixon." Big grizzled Zeke Valentine poured himself a stiff drink and downed it. Then he glared at Rip Campbell. "You sure played hell, young feller. Throwing me short-handed that away. Troy was a valuable man. You'll have to be almighty good to fill his boots." There was a twinkling glint in his steely eyes. "Meaning just what, sir?" "You're ramrodding this outfit. What's your name?" "Rip Campbell, sir." "Rip. Ever run a cow outfit, Rip?" "Yes, sir." Troy fired what cowhands I had working for me. They wasn't tough enough, he claimed, to get the job done. I kind of pensioned them off, without Troy knowing. Rick can locate them and fetch them back. They ain't what you'd call fighting men. But I reckon in a tight they can dig into their bedrolls and war sacks and haul out a gun apiece. You won't have to get them drunk to make them tackle Troy and them tough hands he fetched along to take their places when he fired them old ranny hands. The damn old sons is camped down on the river, catfishing, and roundsiding. Some of Ward Dixon's old hands threw in with them. They was let out when Ward Dixon hired Ralph Millsap for a ramrod. Millsap claimed he couldn't use them all. They call them mossyhorns. Rick can hire them back. Offer them fighting wages, Rick, said Rip. And tell them I still got the seat left in my britches. Rip grinned at Zeke Valentine, then at Polly. I stayed all night at their camp. They told me the dogs would bite. Zeke Valentine gave him a hard look, then told Polly she'd better call her hounds before Troy and his outfit commenced killing the dogs they all hated. Polly whistled and the hall filled with hounds. They came piling into the big room. "It had them in my room," she said. "Just in case." Then she tossed 6 cartridges on the table and told Zeke and Rip to pry the lead bullets out. Rip opened them with his jackknife blade. None of the cartridges had any powder in the brass shells. Polly told her uncle she'd seen Troy put the cartridges in Rip's 6-shooter. Rick had given her the cartridges from Rip Campbell's gun after swapping the 6-shooter. "Troy aimed to murder Rip," Polly said quietly. "Right here in my ranch house." "Why?" Rick put the question bluntly. "Troy," said Rip Campbell, "don't like strangers. Let it go at that." Rick Valentine had been edging towards the big table and Rip Campbell thought it was the whiskey he was after. Then he saw Rick reach out with a furtive show of carelessness and pick up the folded eye. "Oh, yous," Troy had laid there. But before Rick could destroy the papers, his sister said something in a low tone to the Dane. Without a sound or show of ferocity, the big dog grabbed Rick's wrist and held it, and it was only when the young cowman tried to yank free that the big Dane's fangs clamped tighter, but still not deep enough to tear the skin. Rick Valentine's face whitened. Polly smiled faintly and walked over unhurriedly and took the several folded papers from her brother's hand. "Don't be a sneaking cheat, bub." Her voice was quiet-toned. She nodded to the Dane and he let go. "They're mine. My money bought them." Polly put the folded papers in her pocket without looking at them. Rick's face was livid and he rubbed his wrist where the big dog's teeth had clamped. Zeke Valentine had gone out onto the porch and saw nothing of the strange little byplay inside the room. "It ain't any of my business," said Rip Campbell, "but if it was me, I'd check them. Zero. Use against the money I paid for them." Polly's smile chilled. But she took the folded papers out of her pocket and glanced at them quickly. 5 notes. Each for $1,000. "Right, bub?" And each of them there was a nasty tone to Rick Valentine's voice. "Made out to Jim Dixon." "Right, sis." His eyes held hers. Polly's face reddened and her head tilted high. Rip Campbell turned and walked out onto the big veranda to join old Zeb Valentine. "Yonder," growled Zeke Valentine, "go Troy and his outfit. It's all yours now, Rip." There was something almighty wrong there at the Valentine Ranch. Something dark and ugly and sinister. Brief glimpses of it came to light, then were hidden again before Rip Campbell got a good look at what he'd seen. Rick's drinking, his gambling debts, the look in his eyes when he said those I.0.you. Notes were made out to Jim Dixon. And the flush that had colored Polly's face, the hard bright green glint in her eyes as though she wanted to slap her brother's mouth shut. Getting rid of Troy was only the beginning. Rip Campbell had smoked Troy and his renegades out into the open. But from now on he'd have to watch his step. Get a line on things. Trust nobody. Trust Polly Valentine least of all because she was as dangerous as she was beautiful. Polly and her big black Dane devil. Her hound pack. Polly had seen that law badge and had drawn her own conclusions, let it ride like that. She'd said she needed Rip's help. But getting rid of Troy might have been what she meant. Rip Campbell had a notion that somehow Polly Valentine had double-crossed the ramrod. That Troy had let her watch him Dr. Rip Campbell's 6-shooter, then left her to ride close herd on the stranger. And Polly had played both ends against the middle, gambling that Rip Campbell would kill Troy with Rick's gun. Rip had watched her narrowly when she opened the door and stood with the big black Dane. She'd showed her disappointment at seeing Troy alive after that shot. Polly Valentine had a cold-blooded streak in her beautiful makeup. Even as her brother Rick was weak. In her own clever way she had pitted Rip Campbell against Troy because she wanted to get rid of Troy. The big handsome ramrod was getting the upper hand here at the ranch, getting too tight a tail-hold on the outfit and perhaps jockeying Polly into a pocket. Polly wouldn't stand for Troy or anyone to get the upper hand. She wanted to hold the whip. Rip Campbell warned himself that he'd have to watch his step or he'd fall in love with Polly Valentine. Rip Campbell bedded down and slept until supper time. Rick had pulled out, gone to fetch the old crew of cowhands Troy had fired. Polly had saddled her horse and ridden away with her pack of hounds. When Rip Campbell, shaved, scrubbed with hot water and soap, his wiry black hair trimmed by the Chinese cook, he put on the clean clothes Rick had given him from an ample wardrobe, and went to the house to have a medicine talk with Zeke Valentine. The big cowman motioned him towards the whiskey and a big leather chair. Then he fired what he figured was a verbal gunshot. "Got a law badge in your pocket, ain't you, Rip?" Rip Campbell poured himself a drink and grinned. "My dad's law badge. I'm packing it for luck. They murdered him when he cut the sign of some cattle rustlers that was trailing a big drive of stolen cattle out of Wyoming into Montana. And they shot me up some. You got some of them stolen cattle now in your hard iron, Zeke." Ward Dixon put the rest of them in his quarter circle D brand. Troy and Ralph Millsap made the dicker for Zeke Valentine and Ward Dixon. "Stop me when I get on the wrong trail. Go right on talking, young feller." This range war between Zeke Valentine and Ward Dixon, Rip Campbell held his drink in his hand. "It sure fools the natives, don't it, Zeke?" The remark caught the big grizzled cowman swallowing a big shot of raw whiskey. He choked and sputtered and coughed. Then, when he was through coughing, he leaned forward in his heavy leather chair, his slitted steely eyes peering through bushy brows. "Right now, by Jehoshaphat," he growled, "it's fooling me and Ward Dixon." His big fist slammed down on the arm of his leather chair. "How long has it been, Zeke, since you rode away from your home ranch alone?" "Too long. If I ride out alone, day or night, I get shot at and hardly missed. I don't know what in thunder goes on out on my own range. I got a weak-spined, gutless nephew. I got a niece that keeps a pack of dogs that'll drag a man off his horse and chaw his throat out if she gives them such orders. That damn Troy and his tough hands been running my outfit for me. Till you showed up. You got shut of Troy. What's your next move, young fellow?" "I'm riding over to the quarter circle D home ranch," said Rip Campbell. "If my luck holds, I aim to smoke out Ralph Millsap like I crowded Troy into the open." "Lone-handed?" "Lone-handed." Rip nodded. "That's the only way I can get the job done." "Meaning, Rip, you can't trust nobody but yourself?" Rip Campbell nodded. "Myself ain't pickings." "Meaning Polly?" chuckled Zeke Valentine. Rip Campbell's tanned face colored darkly. His grin was lopsided. "Meaning Polly. You cold trailed them stolen cattle here, Rip. Could be you might send me and Ward Dixon to the pen. And trusting for taking delivery on them cattle that's now wearing my heart and Ward Dixon's quarter circle D and the brand's hardly haired over. The Deer Lodge pen wouldn't be much worse than being held prisoner on my own home ranch. But I got a notion that ain't your game, son." "No, sir. I'd trust you and Ward Dixon all the way down the line. You're both old-timers. Cowmen. No better, no worse than other big cattle outfits. It don't matter right now how you and Ward Dixon got messed up in the cattle rustling. It's Troy and Ralph Millsap I'm after." "Why the devil didn't you kill Troy when you had your chance, son?" "I don't know," admitted Rip. "Except that I knew that Polly Valentine expected me to kill Troy. So instead I just pulled his fangs and watched the results." "Satisfied with them results, Rip?" "Not plumb satisfied. Puzzled. I got to fit the chunks of that puzzle together. I might be giving Troy and Ralph Millsap enough rope to hang theirselves. Providing they don't lynch you with that rope." "Yes, sir. It was Polly told you I had a law badge, Zeke?" "Yep. She warned me. Then took her damn hounds and rode off." "Rode off," said Rip Campbell, his voice hard, tainted with bitterness, "to warn Jim Dixon." "Maybe. Or maybe so just to warn Ward Dixon. Hard to figure what Polly will do." "It was Jim Dixon," said Rip Campbell slowly, "who took delivery on the stolen cattle. Paid Troy and Ralph Millsap. Cash on the barrelhead." Rick was representing for the Valentine Hard Iron when the cattle were branded at the camp on the Missouri River where Rick's gone to gather your old crew of cowhands. "Where was Polly?" "Here. Right here at the home ranch. With her dogs. Riding close herd on men Ward Dixon. The three of us playing poker. Polly raking in the big jackpots. And every time me or Ward started out a door, there'd be one of them damned hounds barring the way." Zeke Valentine cussed into his ragged gray mustache, poured himself another drink and downed it. Rip Campbell grimed flatly. "That's all I want to know, Zeke." Rip downed his drink and got to his feet, hitching up his cartridge belt with its holstered six-shooter. He was packing his own gun again. I'm pulling out now for the Quarter Circle D home ranch, Zeke. I just saw Polly ride up to the barn with her hound pack. So she'll be here to ride herd on you. And your job will be to keep her from trailing me when I pull out. Zeke Valentine nodded. You got guts, Rip. And I hope you got the horse sense to go with them guts. Come on tight, you can bank on me. Tell Ward Dixon what me and you been talking over and old Ward will back any play you make. I'll shake on it. They gripped hands and Rip left the big grizzled cowman standing there with a fresh drink in his hand. Polly met Rip at the barn. The Dane shoved his massive head into Rip's hand. The big brindle pack leader circled him warily, then sniffed his hand and let Rip scratch his scarred head and ragged ears. Then the other hounds made their friendly overtures. While Polly, dressed in shabby riding clothes, looked on smiling, the hardness gone from her black-fringed deep green eyes. You're the only man they ever picked out for me, Rip. Reckon there's something prophetic in it? Rip Campbell felt his face and ears redden hotly. Not, he said boldly, watching her eyes. While I got tough competition like Jim Dixon. Polly still smiled. But the soft gay sparkle died in her eyes and left them as cold as deep winter ice. You and Uncle Zeke must have had quite a medicine talk. Her husky voice was quiet. I told him about your law badge. Yeah. I know. Thoughtful of you. Polly pulled off her buckskin gauntlet gloves. She slapped the leg of her shabby leather divided skirt. Her almost heavy black brows knit into a level line. Where were you thinking of going? She asked coldly. Riding. Horse and dogs need the exercise. Before supper? I ate a lone supper. If I told the dogs to keep you out of the barn, I'd hate to shoot that big black Dane. I like dogs. They like me. The black gun is the only one you could make charge me. Zeke Valentine hired me to ramrod his outfit, riding. I'm giving the orders here now. Not taking them. Let's try to get along that away. Rip Campbell grinned faintly, his eyes watching hers. And he saw the hard glitter melt in the girl's green eyes. Watched them darken with something like fear. Then she reached out and took his hand. You give the orders, Rip. Have to put it another way. I'm afraid. Afraid they'll kill you if you ride away from here alone. Like they've threatened to kill Uncle Zeke. He's told you, perhaps, that he's a prisoner here on his own home ranch. I've had to keep him here. For his own protection. Those men are playing for keeps. Don't ride away from here alone, Rip. They'll murder you. Then it's all in a day's while, Polly. You ride herd on Zeke. I'm taking a little passear. I'm going to make warm medicine with an old-time cattleman named Ward Dixon. Polly Valentine clung tightly to his hand. Hers was cold. And there was no doubting the fear in her eyes. No. No, Rip. Not alone. They'll bushwhack you. Troy and his renegades. Or if you get past them you'll be stopped at the Dixon Drift fence. The gates along that fence are padlocked. Ralph Millsap's tough cowhands are riding fence there. They'll shoot you out of your saddle. I've dodged gun traps before now. It'll be dark. That red moon don't shed much light. I know what I'm riding into. I aim to shoot first if I'm stopped. It's all in the game, lady. What is your game? Killing off men that have needed killing for a long time. Men like Troy. And Ralph Millsap. Maybe so like Jim Dixon. No. You're wrong about Jim Dixon. I rode there today. I went there to see Jim Dixon. About Rick's gambling debts. To find out why those I.0. Notes were made doesn't drink. Out to Jim. Because Jim Dixon is no tin-horn gambler. Penny ante is Jim's speed. He's no fast gunfighter, either. Give Jim Dixon a fair chance, Rip. He never hurt you. You can't hold a grudge against a man you don't even know. You're a law officer. Killing men is part of your trade. But if you kill Jim Dixon, then you're hiding behind a law badge to do plain murder. Why didn't you kill Troy? That's what Zeke Valentine asked me. He'll tell you my answer to that one. Jim Dixon will get his fair chance to clear himself. I don't particularly enjoy shooting a man. Where'll I find him? I don't know. Ralph Millsap stopped me at the big gate. Troy had been to see Millsap. He turned me back. He said Jim Dixon was in town on a drunk. He lied. Jim, not that much. There's trouble coming. Why didn't you kill Troy when I gave you the chance? Ask your Uncle Zeke. So long. Polly. See you when I get back. The red moon was almost hidden tonight in the smoke-filled sky. Rip Campbell rode with his hand near his gun. Several times he rode out and around places where bushwhackers might be waiting. 2 or 3 times he heard little groups of night riding men before they heard or sighted him. That was the advantage of playing it lone-handed. One lone rider can dodge and twist and get through where even 2 men might be discovered. Rip's only disadvantage was not knowing the country. But he had a general idea of its topography. He knew where the quarter circle D home ranch lay and the location of the drift fence. And he was riding a big grain-fed quarter circle D gelding. The horse would take him there if he kept a slack rein. Polly had staked Rip to the big brown gelding. And when she knew he was bound to go alone, she gave him an accurate description of the country between the 2 ranches and the location of several secret key gates in the barbed wire drift fence. Places where the fence cross-cut colley and the wires were so fastened to the fence posts that the key staples could be lifted and the wires raised and a man could lead his horse under the wires and key them back in place on the posts. There was the off chance, she said, that Ralph Millsap's fence riders knew about the key gates Jim Dixon had made in the drift fence long before Millsap moved in to take over with his renegades. Jim Dixon and Polly used those hidden gates. Even Rick knew nothing about them. Only Jim Dixon and Polly Valentine. Rip Campbell had winced a little inside when Polly spoke so intimately of Jim Dixon. But when he got ready to mount, she had put her arms around his neck and kissed him hard, bruising her soft lips against his mouth. A sob in her throat and her green eyes misted with unshed tears. And Rip had held her and kissed her hungrily, roughly, clumsily. "Come back, Rip," she'd whispered, her voice husky. Rip Campbell would come back if he had to shoot every mile of the trail back to the Valentine ranch. No girl had ever moved him like that. But Polly Valentine was no girl. She was a woman. Older, the 25-year-old Rip Campbell suspected, than he was. There were tiny lines etched around the corners of her green eyes and her red-lipped mouth. Polly Valentine could be as old as 30. Too old for Rip Campbell. "Get a tail holt on yourself, Rip," he told himself savagely. But his heart pounded hot blood through his veins. He'd fight his way through hell to get back to the green-eyed, black-haired, red-lipped Polly. And she was in love with Jim Dixon. "She as much as told me so. Hang on to your bushy tail, Rip. Come out of it." The big pole gate in the drift fence loomed up. So close ahead that he sucked in his breath through clenched teeth and slid his 6-shooter from its holster. He sighted the man on horseback, there on the other side of the pole gate. He sensed, rather than saw the man lift his gun, and he shot a split second before the man's gun spat fire. Shot to kill. The man's horse whirled and stampeded. The rider went over backwards and landed with a heavy crash on his head and shoulders and lay there motionless. Rip Campbell spurred up to the gate. Its chain hung down, the padlock open. The man he'd shot must have just unlocked the big padlock and had been about to open the pole gate and ride through. Maybe he'd killed Jim Dixon. No time to stop. Anyway, he wouldn't know Jim Dixon if he found him dead. Rip Campbell leaned from his saddle and pulled the long wooden gate pin. Riding through, he shut it and padlocked the gate behind him and lifted the big brown gelding to a run. He heard a man shout, another man yell back some kind of reply. And Rip Campbell rode like the devil was at his heels. The dead man's horse had fouled its dragging bridle reins in some brush. Rip Campbell quit the wagon road and kept to the brush. It was only about 5 miles to the ranch and he slowed down to a long trot, letting the big brown gelding get its wind. Then he pulled up when he sighted the dim blobs of lighted cabin windows. He rode in behind the heavy willow thicket that flanked the creek, left his horse there, and went on afoot, his saddle carbine in the crook of his left arm. He made out the scattered buildings and pole corrals. A light showed dimly behind drawn blinds in the main house. A rambling 1-storied log house. Rip opened the door without knocking. His 6-shooter was in his right hand, carbine in the crook of his left arm. Then he stood rooted in his tracks. The door opened directly into a large room. A big lamp was set on a large table and a girl of about 19 sat in a rocking chair reading a book. She had curly topper-colored hair and a lot of freckles and dark brown eyes. She was wearing a clean but faded blue flannel man's shirt and faded Levi overalls and a pair of shabby boots that hung by silver-mounted spurs from the scarred edge of the heavy homemade table. She let the book lower, marking the place with her forefinger, and grinned boyishly at him, showing white teeth. "Phew." Her full red lips pursed in a whistle. "Scared me green. I'm reading Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles. Out on the moor, that big slavering hound. Like Polly Valentine's black devil, take off your hat and rest your guns, mister. If you're looking for Jim, he ain't here. If it's Ward you're gunning for, he's got you covered. The rowels of the silver-mounted spurs raked the scarred tabletop. The girl opened the book again and read, or pretended to read. Regular bookworm, drawled a man's voice from behind a huge multicolored Navajo rug that shut off the hallway. But a top cowhand anywhere you put her. And she's a good sure hand with a green bronco. Cooks a bang-up meal when she's a mine too, and makes all her own clothes. And there's a horse and saddle goes with her. Her name's Dizzy. Rip Campbell had shoved his 6-shooter back into its holster and leaned his saddle carbine against the wall and pulled his hat off. He stood there awkwardly, red-eared, his hat in his hand. The man who came out from behind the curtain shoved a long-barreled 6-shooter into its open holster. He was short, wiry, with a leathery face, graying red hair and puckered bright black eyes that missed no detail of Rip's looks. You ain't one of Ralph Millsap's renegades. He was soft-spoken with an easy grin. Maybe Jim sent you. No, sir. I rode over from the Valentine place. We got rid of Troy. I'm ramrodding the outfit. Hiring back Zeke's old hands. I come here to see what can be done about smoking out Ralph Millsap. Kind of clean up both outfits. My name's Rip Campbell. Your name is Mud. Troy's rasping voice came from the doorway. Rip Campbell had not shut the door. It had swung open behind him and Troy stood there, grinning, a gun in his left hand, the whip welts ridged on his dark face. You're smart. Troy stepped inside, his gun pointed at Rip Campbell's belly. And the tall rawboned cowpuncher who crowded in behind Troy was, Rip reckoned, Ralph Millsap. Ralph Millsap was on the younger side of 30. Lantern-jawed, light-haired, with a high-bridged nose and pale blue eyes. Young, tough and merciless, he was a cold-blooded killer. He pushed past Troy who stood just inside the doorway, and walked over to where the girl Dixie sat in her rocker, so white now that her freckles were a black smudge. Fear and loathing in her eyes as she shrank away from Ralph Millsap's pawing hand. Keep your filthy paws off my daughter. Ward Dixon stepped forward. Ralph Millsap's 6-shooter chopped down across Dixon's head, knocking him backwards. Millsap's buck teeth bared in a nasty grin. Take it easy, Pappy. His voice was a nasal whine. Rip Campbell dared not make a move. Yet. Troy's gun was a hair-triggered 6-shooter ready to blast his guts out. There was murder in Troy's pale bloodshot eyes. Ward Dixon had grabbed hold of the edge of the table to steady himself. Blood was oozing from his ripped scalp. Rip Campbell winced a little under the quick contemptuous look Dixie Dixon cut him. Ralph Millsap stank of bad whiskey. He pawed at the girl again, a leering grin on his muddy yellow-colored face. She twisted away and kicked him hard in the shins. Millsap let out a yelp of pain and stumbled after her as she dodged in behind her father. But Rip Campbell was not watching the girl and Millsap. He was watching Troy. Troy was taking it all in with a thin-lipped grin, but his pale eyes were fixed on Rip Campbell. And Troy's back was to the open doorway so he could not see what Campbell saw. A black shape that moved without a sound, crouched, with white fangs bared and yellow eyes shining in the dark. Without a warning growl the big black Dane devil sprang. Long, powerful jaws, clamping down, sharp white fangs buried deep in the back and side of Troy's neck. Troy let out a horrible scream. The gun in his hand exploded. Rip Campbell threw himself sideways and the bullet whined past his head. He jerked his gun and whirled, intending to shoot at Ralph Millsap. But Millsap had grabbed Dixie and Rip Campbell dared not risk a shot for fear of hitting the girl. Millsap's gun spat flame and Rip Campbell felt the burning, thudding impact of the bullet grazing his ribs. He cleared the table and crashed heavily into Millsap and the girl and the three of them went down in a tangled pile. Then Dixie scrambled free. Troy's injured right hand and arm had gone up to protect his throat as the Dane knocked him off his feet. Troy shoved his hand and forearm blindly into the dog's mouth, clubbing at the black Dane's massive head. Then blood spilled from Troy's torn neck and his horrible screams filled the room. The dog's fangs ripped and slashed. Meanwhile out yonder in the smoky night there sounded the pounding of shod hoofs and guns roaring and men shouting hoarsely. And the voice of one man lifted above the other sounds. Get at them, you 40-a-month-old ranny hands. Charge them, Zeke. Jim. Jim, yelled Dixie Dixon. Ward Dixon stood with blood trickling into his eyes, knocked out but still on his feet, his gun in his hand but too blind from blood and toe in to see what to shoot at. Rip Campbell heard the confusion only dimly. He saw nothing but the ugly lantern-jawed face of Ralph Millsap. Saw that face through a red film of hate. And for the first time in his life, Rip Campbell wanted to kill a man with his bare hands. He wanted to kill Ralph Millsap for the simple reason that the tough young renegade had manhandled that red-headed freckle-faced girl, who was a bookworm but a top cowhand and had a way with a green bronco but could cook a bang-up meal and make her own clothes. Ralph Millsap clubbed at Rip's head with his gun barrel. Rip Campbell grabbed the gun with both hands as it chopped down, yanking hard and pulling Millsap sideways and down and off balance. Jerking the gun free, he threw it away. Rip didn't realize he'd dropped his own gun in his headlong red hate, his savage determination to kill this vicious, snarling renegade with his bare hands. And he grabbed Millsap's throat with his left hand and his right fist smashed short vicious blows into Ralph Millsap's sweaty face. Bones crunched under the hammering blows. And Rip Campbell felt no pain when Millsap gouged and pounded and shoved his head down till his big yellow teeth sank into Rip's shoulder. Then Millsap was on top of Rip, his big weight crushing him against the floor. Somehow Rip managed to get both his hands on Ralph Millsap's throat and clamped down and tightened his grip, holding it as though he had steel springs in his fingers. He did not know when Ralph Millsap's teeth slacked their biting punishment, when Ralph Millsap's big dirty nailed fingers quit clawing and gouging. Then a red blood smear blinded Rip Campbell and there was a tremendous weight holding him down, a dead limp weight now. The room filled with sounds. Valentine's booming growl. "Blast it, Polly, call off that black hound." The shooting had stopped outside. Cold water splashed down on Rip Campbell's blood-smeared head and face and he heard Zeke Valentine's growl. "Hell cinders, Rip, slack your grip. Hate to have to cut you loose. Let go, Rip." Millsap's finished. But there was a red film blinding Rip Campbell and they were putting cold wet bandages on his eyes. And somebody was washing his face and head. And there was the taste of raw whiskey in his mouth. He heard Polly Valentine's voice. "Take it easy, Rip. It's all over but the shouting." "Gosh, Polly, he just threw away his gun and came over the table and Zeke, wow. He nailed him. I got a bloody nose." That was Dixie's voice. Excited. Rip Campbell pawed off the bandages and blinked away the red film. But it was not Polly or Dixie he saw. It was a big black Dane's head, tongue lolling, white fangs showing, yellow eyes looking down into his. Then the big red tongue swiped him alongside the head and Rip reached up and rubbed the massive sleek black head. Then the huge black Dane lay down alongside him. "On guard." "Phew," gasped Dixie Dixon's voice.
For a second, I was scared green.
"Looks like I've lost a dog," said Polly. She bent down and kissed Rip Campbell. "The big tramp followed you, Rip." A red-headed cowpuncher with a homely freckled face lifted Polly to her feet and gave her a hard quick hug. Then squatted on his spurred boot heels and gripped Rip Campbell's hand. "I'm Jim Dixon. We got to thank you for a lot, Rip. Me. My kid sister Dixie. My dad Ward. Zeke and I was too far behind when we left the Valentine Ranch to do you much good here. So was Polly and her hounds. But the old Valentine Hard and Quarter Circle D cowpunchers took Troy's and Millsap's renegades like kids eating candy." "Rick fetched them?" "No. I went down to the river camp a couple of days ago. Hired them all back for both outfits. We found Rick near the Valentine Ranch. Troy's renegades had killed him. But he got 2 of them before he died. Rick Valentine died fighting. Jim Dixon had never seen those I.0.U.S. until Polly showed them to him. Rick had lost that money to Troy and Troy had made out the I.0.U.S. in Jim Dixon's name. He had hoped to make Polly hate Jim Dixon, the one and only man she loved, she told them all. Jim's so doggone homely, she explained. And it was Jim Dixon who explained about the stolen cattle. A lot of cattle were being trailed out of Wyoming. There was a range war down there. Cowmen were trailing their cattle to Montana before the rustlers whittled on them. Selling cattle cheap. Troy and Millsap had pointed such a trail herd to Montana. They'd showed Jim Dixon bills of sale for the irons in the mixed herd. Jim Dixon and Rick Valentine, repping for the Valentine Hard and Dixon Quarter Circle D, had paid cash for the cattle. And it wasn't until the cattle were branded in the Hard and Quarter Circle D that Jim Dixon and Rick Valentine learned that the bills of sale were forgeries and they had a lot of stolen cattle in their irons. From then on it was blackmail. Troy and Ralph Millsap moved in with their renegades. They fired the old cowhands and spread the rumor of a range war between the two outfits. And they threatened the Valentines and Dixons with prison for handling stolen cattle. Most of those Wyoming cattle wore the Rocking R brand. Rip Campbell said he and his father had owned the Rocking R. U.S. Marshal Hank Campbell was too busy to spend much time at the ranch. He'd shown up in time to side his son Rip in a tough one-sided gunfight with the cattle rustlers. The running gunfight had happened at night with a stampede of a big herd Rip Campbell had gathered. But Rip Campbell said he reckoned Troy and Ralph Millsap had ramrodded the night-raiding rustlers. The same renegade pack that was now wiped out. U.S. Marshal Hank Campbell had been killed. For weeks Rip Campbell had lain flat on his back in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. It was months before he could sit a horse again. Then he had sold the ranch in Wyoming, put his father's law badge in his pocket, and took the cold trail of his stolen cattle. "They're yours, Rip," said Polly, putting tallow on their ribs on a new range. "Free grazing. And you've got to stay with us till they're gathered this fall and shipped. Till after our wedding." "Doesn't he have to stay, Jim?" "I need him for best man," grinned the red-headed, freckled Jim Dixon. Zeke Valentine and Ward Dixon were getting slowly, quietly drunk. Cussing one another. Swapping their top horses. Somehow they all drifted outside. And only Dixie and Rip Campbell, Rip, in clean clothes and both eyes discolored and swollen to slits and his face battered looking, were left there in the big room that had been cleaned up. Big Devil was stretched out at Rip's feet. Dixie moved in her chair and the big dog get up and walked over to her and shoved his massive head into her lap. She gave a little start of surprise and then began gently rubbing the swollen lumps where Troy's gun barrel had struck glancing blows before his jugular vein was torn and he died horribly. "The Hound of the Baskervilles." Dixie shuddered. "I'll never be able to finish that book. Not while I'm alone." But she buried her curly red head in Devil's sleek black shoulder. Rip Campbell squatted on his boot heels beside the big dog and took her hand. And somehow he managed to tell Dixie Dixon that he was in love with her. He'd known it the second Ralph Millsap had pawed her. So that was why he had to throw away his gun and fight Ralph Millsap with his hands. "Sounds locoed, don't it?" He grinned. "Nope. Not to me, it doesn't sound anything but grand, Rip. Only I was scared you'd take days, even weeks to get around to it." "Then you'll marry me, Dixie?" "Whenever you say, Rip. My horse and saddle goes with me," Ward said. "I think you'd better kiss me now." Rip Campbell kissed her. Devil swiped the backs of their necks with his tongue, then stalked outside with a Great Dane's splendid dignity. Out to where Jim Dixon and Polly sat in the porch swing. Polly rubbed the big dog's ears. "It worked, Jim." When Devil walked over and shoved his head into Dixie's lap, Rip took the hint. Rip remembered something I said to him. About Devil picking out a man for me. I was just teasing Rip. He's so darn bashful. "He does all right for a backward country boy," grinned Jim Dixon. "Say. I just remembered something. The day that big black pup of yours made up to me like that and you said he'd picked out a man for you. And that gave me the nerve to tell you you had to marry me. Remember?" Polly's green eyes softened. She laughed huskily and kissed him. "You better change his name. From Devil to Cupid." And at the far end of the porch Ward Dixon and Zeke Valentine clinked filled glasses and grinned in the smoky moonlight. "Double wedding, Zeke." "Double wedding, Ward." They downed their drinks and smashed the empty glasses. The end. Can I send you Wrangler for free? More work by the author. California Toothpick. Bone Orchard. Crowbait. Tin Horn. Cowpoke. Beets dying. Out and Out. Bangtail. Blue Blazes. 5 beans in the wheel. Piebald. Hogleg. Noose Fever. Pan Out. 6-Gun Destiny. Holster Holiday. Overcareful. Pack Iron. Old Pie. Played Out. High Range Revenge. Old Rats. Pony Up. Roostered. High Cash Outlaw. Troubleshooter. Hang Tree Bait. Trigger Bait. Lone Hand. Fair Shake. Fetch Up. Rail Range. Noose Bait. Trail Rush. Knock Round Sirs. Audacious. Horse.